Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to this week's workshop, which is going to be on the Black Power movement and the Black Arts movement. Okay, so firstly, I just wanted to emphasize the kind of ongoing legacies of the Black Power movement. So you can see from Beyonce's performance at the Super Bowl from 2016 that she was recalling the Black Power movement of the 60s and 70s. This was condemned as inappropriate and divisive by some commentators. So it might be interesting to think about why this was so controversial and what the basis of that was. And hopefully by the end of today, you'll have a sense of why some people disagreed with Beyonce referencing the Black Power movement. So I just wanted to highlight again the civil rights timeline that we looked at last week. But perhaps this week we'd be thinking about it more from a perspective of, okay, the things that were gained, for example, the March on Washington and then the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But some of the kind of moments of radicalization here that lead away from Martin Luther King and into kind of Malcolm X and the Black Power movement. So there's three significant assassinations, as you probably know, in the 60s. There's the assassination of JFK, of Kennedy. Then there's the assassination of Malcolm X in 1965. And finally, you have the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968. And I think for a lot of people, by the time you get to the Martin Luther King assassination, there's a sense of frustration and exasperation with the kind of situation in the United States in terms of race, which creates a much more widespread sense of radicalization than there ever had been before. But I'm going to start today by talking about another organization that was very important during the Civil Rights Movement and onwards, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the SNCC, as I'll be calling it. So the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was founded in April 1960 by young people dedicated to nonviolent direct action tactics. So non-violent, i.e. non-aggressive, non-violence, but direct action, meaning you go and do that action in person. Although Martin Luther King Jr. and others had hoped that the SNCC would serve as the youth wing of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the students remained fiercely independent of King and generated their own projects and strategies. Although ideological differences eventually caused the SNCC and Martin Luther King's organisation to be at odds, they both worked side by side throughout the early years of the civil rights movement. So probably up until around 64, 65, they were working together. The idea for a locally based student-run organisation was conceived when Ella Baker, a veteran civil rights organiser and an SCLC, which is Martin Luther King's organisation, official, invited Black students who had participated in the early 1960s sit-ins to an April 1960 gathering at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. Baker encouraged more than 200 student attendees to remain autonomous rather than affiliate with Martin Luther King or any of the other existing civil rights groups. So they always remained autonomous, this group, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. At the Raleigh conference, the students were generally reluctant to compromise the independence of their local protest groups and voted to establish only a temporary coordinating body. James Lawson, whose workshops on nonviolent direct action served as a training ground for many of the Nashville student protests, drafted an organizational statement of purpose that reflected the strong commitment to Gandhian, that is Gandhi, non-violence that characterised the SNCC's early years. So, quote, "We affirm the philosophical or religious ideal of non-violence as the foundation of our purpose, the presupposition of our faith, and the manner of our action. Non-violence, as it grows from Judaic-Christian traditions, seeks social order of justice permeated by love." The SNCC's emergence as a force in the Southern Civil Rights Movement came largely through its involvement of students in the 1961 Freedom Rides, designed to test a 1960 Supreme Court ruling that declared segregation in interstate travel facilities unconstitutional. The Congress of Racial Equality initially sponsored the Freedom Rides that began in May 1961, but segregationists viciously attacked riders travelling through Alabama. Students from Nashville, under the leadership of Diane Nash, resolved to finish the rides. Once the new group of Freedom Riders demonstrated their determination to continue the ride into Mississippi, other students joined the movement. By the time the Interstate Commerce Commission began enforcing the ruling mandating equal treatment in interstate travel in November 1961, the SNCC was immersed in voter registration efforts in Mica, Mississippi, and a desegregation campaign in Albany, Georgia, known as the Albany Movement. Martin Luther King's movement later joined with the SNCC in Albany, but tensions arose between the two civil rights groups. The Albany effort, although yielding few tangible gains, was an important site of the development for the SNCC. At the August 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the SNCC chairman, John Lewis, was one of those scheduled to speak. He intended to criticise John F. Kennedy's proposed civil rights bill as, quote, too little and too late, and to refer to the movement as a serious revolution. Lewis softened the tone of the delivered speech to appease A. Philip Randolph and other march organisers, but he remained adamant that the SNCC had great reservations regarding Kennedy's proposed civil rights legislation. He warned his audience, "We want our freedom and we want it now." In 1961, organiser Bob Moses moved to Jackson, Mississippi, and began organising young Mississippi residents. Moses, who was firmly committed to non-hierarchical grassroots organising, joined the SNCC staff and became a voter registration director of Mississippi's Council of Federated Organizations. So non-hierarchical grassroots organizing basically means organizing that comes from within local communities based on what local communities actually need. And non-hierarchical means that there isn't a kind of fixed structure in place of how things get done, for example, like a president or a strict kind of order of how things need to be decided, but instead it's much more democratic, kind of open structure. So Moses encountered considerable resistance to civil rights reform efforts, but the Mississippi voter registration effort created conditions for racial reform by bringing together three crucial groups. Dynamic and determined SNCC field secretaries, influential regional and local civil rights leaders from Mississippi, and white student volunteers who participated in the Freedom Vote mock election of October 1963 and the Freedom Summer of 1964. Early in 1964, the SNCC supported the formation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in an effort to challenge the legitimacy of the state's all-white Democratic Party. The voting rights demonstrations that began in 1965 in Selma, Alabama, sparked increasingly bitter ideological debates within the SNCC, as some workers openly challenged the group's previous commitment to nonviolent tactics and its willingness to allow the participation of white activists. Distracted by such divisive issues, the day-to-day needs of the group's ongoing projects suffered. In many Deep South communities where the SNCC had once attracted considerable Black support, the group's influence waned. Nevertheless, after the Selma to Montgomery March, Stokely Carmichael and other SNCC organisers entered the rural area between Selma and Montgomery and helped Black residents launch the all-Black Lowndes County Freedom Organisation, later known as the Black Panther Party. Meanwhile, several SNCC workers established incipient organising efforts in volatile urban Black ghettos. So if you don't know, the Selma to Montgomery March was met with fierce police brutality, and many Black activists were beaten up and put in jail, which was another kind of important moment of radicalisation for these activists. In May 1966, a new stage in SNCC's history began with Carmichael's election as chairman. Because Carmichael identified himself with the trend away from nonviolence and interracial cooperation, his election compromised the SNCC's relationship with more moderate civil rights groups and many of its white supporters. So it's now moving towards violence, direct action, and also not for interracial cooperation, i.e. Black power. During the month following his election, Carmichael publicly expressed the SNCC's new political orientation when he began calling for, quote, Black power during a voter rights march through Mississippi. The national exposure of Carmichael's Black power speeches brought increased notoriety to the SNCC, but the group remained internally divided over its future direction. Martin Luther King responded directly to Carmichael's and the SNC's appeal for Black power in his 1967 book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? King argued, quote, effective political power for Negroes cannot come through separatism. Opposing exclusive support for Black electoral candidates, King continued, SNCC staff members are eminently correct when they point out that in Lowndes County, Alabama, there are no white liberals or moderates and no possibility for a cooperation between races at the present time. But the Lowndes County experience cannot be made a measuring rod for the whole of America. Even after the dismissal of a group of SNCC Atlanta field workers who called for the exclusion of whites, the organisation was weakened by continued internal conflicts and external attacks, along with a loss of northern financial backing. The election in June 1967 of H. Rap Brown as SNCC's new chairman was meant to reduce the controversy surrounding the group. Brown, however, encouraged militancy among urban Blacks, and soon a federal campaign against Black militancy severely damaged SNCC's ability to sustain its organising efforts. The SNCC became a target for the FBI in a concerted effort at all levels of government to crush Black militancy through both overt and covert means. The spontaneous urban uprising that followed the assassination of Martin Luther King in April 1968 indicated a high level of Black discontent. However, by then, the SNCC had little ability to mobilise an effective political force. Its most dedicated community organisers had left the organisation, which changed its name to the Student National Coordinating Committee. Although individuals from SNCC activists played significant roles in politics during the period after 1968, and many of the controversial ideas that had once defined the SNCC's radicalism had become widely accepted among African Americans, the organisation disintegrated. By the end of the decade, FBI surveillance of SNCC's remaining offices was discontinued due to lack of activity. So what I'm going to do now is show you a couple of clips from the Black Panthers to give you an example of the kind of rhetoric that they were using.
explain, you come up with conclusions that don't conclude. You come up with people that you thought should be acting like pigs, just acting like people and moving on pigs. That's what we've got to do. So we're going to see about Bobby, regardless of what these people think we should do. Because school is not important, and work is not important. Nothing's more important than stopping fascism, because fascism will stop us all.
Okay, so that's the first clip of Fred Hampton, who was actually murdered by, well, an FBI coup, essentially. And this is a clip, this is an extract from the 1966 speech by Stokely Carmichael, where he says, "This is the 27th time I've been arrested. I ain't going to jail no more. The only way we are going to stop the white men from whipping us is to take over. What we got to start saying now is Black Power." And that was the birth of the phrase Black Power.
I was working for the city government of Oakland, California at the time. And I was concerned that we had very few politicians. And some of the young people were running around saying Black Power this, Black Power that. And I'm saying, hey, you guys ain't gonna get any kind of power until you take some political seats. Political seats. Yeah, city council seats, county supervisorial seats, all them the white man seats. So you better make up your mind to make it some black folks seats if you want to get some power.
In 1967, I was at Lincoln University, a historical Black university. And someone gave me a copy of Ramparts magazine. If you were awake and concerned about the world and wanted to know more, Ramparts was it. And as I opened the magazine to look at the article, there was a picture of Huey Newton strapped to a hospital gurney with a bullet wound. And I decided to leave and drive across the country to become part of the Huey P. Newton Defense Committee, but also to join the Black Panther Party. Because I read that it was an organization created not just to end police brutality, but the upliftment of all, as the term was then, poor and oppressed people in the world. And that was the kind of organization I wanted to be a part of.
At the time when I joined the Black Panther Party, Huey Newton was on trial in the city of Oakland. And my job at that time was to make sure that Huey arrived at court and left in one piece, you know. So the Suits Committee, which is the governing body of the Black Panther Party, they used to say to me, whatever happened to Huey better happen to you first. So something bad happens to Huey, it better happen to me first. I'm laughing, okay.
My work with the Black Panther Party was really an outgrowth of the kind of family activism that I was blessed with. My mother actually founded the Huey P. Newton Defense Committee, which was an outgrowth of an organization that had been sort of called Honkies for Huey. My mother did not consider herself a honky, but a legitimately concerned social activist who wanted to right something that was wrong. We were white, effectively, most of us, working in predominantly white communities. But we felt at the time that the kind of example and the kind of programs and the kind of perspective that the Black Panther Party had was right for us as well.
It was 1966, I graduated from high school, and Black Power movement was in the air. The Black is Beautiful was in the air. James Brown was song was popular on Black and I'm Proud, you know, and we would be at home and we would be listening to Malcolm X speaks on the album, you know, and it felt like contraband.
For us in the Black community, especially aware students, it was our 9/11. We tried the olive branch, we tried peace. We will no longer accept them just coming in and killing us. We're going to defend ourselves from now on and also inform our people about their legal rights. So thus was born the concept of the Black Panther Party for self-defense.
Okay, and so what the activity you're going to do for the end of this half is to, we're going to watch a short clip which compares the kind of politics of Martin Luther King to that of Malcolm X, and then what would then become the Black Panther Party. And I just want you to create a little table and then just to compare their different forms of political action and their ideological differences.
The white man pays Reverend Martin Luther King, subsidizes Reverend Martin Luther King, so that Reverend Martin Luther King can continue to teach the Negroes to be defenseless. That's what you mean by nonviolence. Be defenseless. Be defenseless in the face of one of the most cruel beasts that has ever taken the people into captivity. That's this American white man. And they have proved it throughout the country by the police dogs and the police clubs. 100 years ago, they used to put on a white sheet and use a bloodhound against Negroes. Today, they've taken off the white sheet and put on police uniform. They've traded in the bloodhounds for police dogs, and they're still doing the same thing. And just as Uncle Tom, back during slavery, used to keep the Negroes from resisting the bloodhound or resisting the Ku Klux Klan by teaching them to love their enemy or pray for those who use them despitefully, today Martin Luther King is just a 20th century or modern Uncle Tom or a religious Uncle Tom who is doing the same thing today to keep Negroes defenseless in the face of attack that Uncle Tom did on the plantation to keep those Negroes defenseless in the face of the attack that was planned in that.
Well, I don't think of love as, in this context, as emotional bosh. I don't think of it as a weak force. But I think of love as something strong and that organizes itself into powerful direct action. Now, this is what I try to teach in the struggle in the South, that we are not engaged in a struggle that means we sit down and do nothing. That there's a great deal of difference between non-resistance to evil and non-violent resistance. Non-resistance leaves you in a state of stagnant passivity and deadening complacency, wherein non-violent resistance means that you do resist in a very strong and determined manner. And I think some of the criticisms of nonviolence, or some of the critics, fail to realize that we are talking about something very strong, and they confuse non-resistance with nonviolence.
The goal of Dr. Martin Luther King is to give Negroes a chance to sit in a segregated restaurant beside the same white man who had brutalized them for 400 years. The goal of Dr. Martin Luther King is to get Negroes to forgive the people who have brutalized them for 400 years by lulling them to sleep and making them forgetting what those whites have done to them. But the masses of black people in America today don't go for what Martin Luther King is putting down. As you said in one of your articles, is psychologically insecure or something of that sort. I forget how you put it. But you didn't endorse what Martin Luther King was doing yourself.
I do not reject his goals of full integration and full equality rights for American citizens. Do you reject these goals?
If you don't think that he's walking on the right road, I'm quite sure you don't agree that he'll get to the right place. And if you would classify his method as psychologically unrealistic, I think that a man's method is psychologically unrealistic, which means the road or the means or the method that he's using, I think as a psychologist, you'd be very doubtful
I don't think
that
that's
he would reach
true.
the right.
If anyone has ever lived with a nonviolent movement in the South, from Montgomery on through the Freedom Rides and through the sit-in movement and the recent Birmingham movement, and see the reactions of many of the extremists and reactionaries in the white community, he wouldn't say that this movement makes, this philosophy makes them comfortable. I think it arouses a sense of shame within them often in many instances. I think it does something to touch the conscience and establish a sense of guilt. Now, so often people respond to guilt by engaging more in the guilt-evoking act in an attempt to drown the sense of guilt. But this approach certainly doesn't make the white man feel comfortable. It disturbs this conscience, and it disturbs this sense of contentment.
Nothing will they ever do. They will always talk it, but they won't practice it. And with the Supreme Court, if the NAACP can tell me that they want a desegregation decision for me 10 years ago, but yet the schools haven't been desegregated, as I say, this is a victory with no victory. It's a victory that you can talk about, but it's a victory you can't show me. So if you represent the NAACP and you're telling me about this great victory you won for me, when I look at you, I have to conclude that either you have been duped yourself or else you were trying to dupe me. And in most instances where the civil rights struggle is involved, there is no civil rights leader can point to me one concrete gain, practical gain that Black people have made in the civil rights field in this country, not only during the past 10 years, but during the past 100 years.
I don't think there's any real organization to the riots. I think they grow out of the conditions that I've mentioned all along. And as long as these intolerable conditions are there, as long as the Negro finds himself living every day in a major depression, then every city will sit on a powder keg and can explode over the slightest incident. I feel that killing is a very tragic way to deal with any social problem. There is no violent solution to the problem that the Negro confronts in this country, and this is why I have constantly said that riots are socially destructive and self-defeating. After all, the Negro ends up on the losing end. We can't win a violent revolution. Most of the persons killed in riots are Negroes themselves. The persons who end up not being able to get milk for their children are Negroes because things where they have to live are destroyed. So there's no practical or moral answer in the realm of violence to the Negro's problem. But I do understand the sociological, the psychological, and the economic reasons.
Can be found. First, the white man and the black man have to be able to sit down at the same table. The white man has to feel free to speak his mind without hurting the feelings of that Negro. And the so-called Negro has to feel free to speak his mind without hurting the feelings of the white man. Then they can bring the issues that are under the rug out on top of the table and take an intelligent approach to get the problem solved. That's the only way that they'll ever do it. We need an action program while we are Muslims, while we are Christians, or while we are whatever we are. We still need an action program that will eliminate these evils that are in our community. And this is what we're trying to do with the Muslim Mosque Incorporated. Do you consider yourself militant? I consider myself militant.
Well, I think we have to agree that this appears to be the result of an internal conflict within the Black nationalist movement. So I think the first thing that needs to be done is for a conference of goodwill to take place between Black nationalist leaders. This was why I suggested a few days ago that the followers of the late Malcolm X and the followers of Elijah Muhammad should sit down at the peace table together, so to speak, and discuss this problem and try to reach some understanding. I don't think, and I'm sure, that nothing can be accomplished by violence. It only leads to new and more complex social problems. I think it is unfortunate for the Black nationalist movement. I think it is unfortunate for the health of our nation.
I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
I'm really happy for you. I'll let you finish. But Beyonce had one of the best videos.